In this presentation, we'll be talking about the history of French and Italian keyboard music and how each have affected / been inspired by the other. Also, we'll be playing works from 7 different composers of both French and Italian descent. Before I talk about French keyboard literature, I would like to acknowledge French literature in general, as labels that applied to one art during this era were also applied to other artists. So artistic movements that were vital to the evolvement of literature were also seen in French music. So, French literature in general enjoyed enormous international prestige and success in the 19th century. The first part of the century was dominated by Romanticism. This was also seen in French music, but I will not go into detail about that today. Around the mid-century, realism emerged, at least partly as a reaction to Romanticism. And in the last half of the 19th century, naturalism, Parnassian poetry, and symbolism, among other styles, were often competing tendencies at the same time. I will talk about symbolism later on. Some writers formed into literary groups defined by a name and a program or manifesto. In other cases, these expressions were merely derogatory terms given by critics to certain writers or have been used by literary historians to group writers of different projects or methods. Nevertheless, these labels can be used in describing broad historical developments in the arts, specifically music. To give an even broader look at life in this area, it was seen that democratic ideals and the Industrial Revolution swept through Europe and changed the daily lives of citizens at all levels. Struggles between the old order and the new were the root causes of conflicts from the Napoleonic Wars to the American Civil War. From New York to London to Vienna, the world was changing, and the consequences can still be felt to this day. The lives of musicians, composers, and makers of musical instruments were greatly altered by these social changes that I just mentioned. Before these changes, musicians were usually employed by either the church or the court and were servants to aristocratic circles. Composers wrote music for performances in these venues, and musical instrument makers produced instruments to be played by wealthy patrons or their servant musicians. But now, with the rise of the middle class, more people wanted access to music performances and music education. Music became something for everyone, rather than just for the wealthy and the noble. Here is the basic outline showing major historical events and how they line up with the broad musical eras. As you can see, we have Baroque, Classical, Romantic, 20th century, and 21st century. So near the end of the Classical era, in 1804, Napoleon became emperor. Near the start of the Romantic era was the French Revolution in 1830. Near the end of the Romantic era, the Eiffel Tower was completed in Paris in 1889. And in the 20th century, we have both of the world wars. And here's the timeline of music history with the 4 pieces that I have chose to play during this presentation. So number 1, the impromptu, the first piece that I'm going to play, came 13 years after the French Revolution. Number 2, the Premier Gymnopédie was written 1 year before the completion of the Eiffel Tower. Number 3, Des Pas sur la Neige was 4 years before the start of World War I. And number 4, Staccato was written 3 years before World War II. I felt it important to mention female composers during this time. As we are well aware, female composers were not as well known as their male counterparts were, and they were paid significantly less for it as well. A quote that I found sums up this scenario very well. A composer with a desire for an audience has to be in possession of skills that have very little to do with music. They need to be capable of self-promotion, fundraising, and confidence, all things that have been discouraged in female composers. Women were typically looked at as singers, and even sometimes as good performers, but never as composers. So, as we look back on music history, we see names such as Mozart, Debussy, and Bach, but very rarely do we see female composers. The women in this history of composing are anomalies, and if they were heard of, it was because of a wealthy father or husband. This quote gives a great example of the persistence and passion of female composers. They did not seek out or seek to create a female tradition, nor did they wait for a female teacher or mentor. They invariably worked with and within a male-dominated musical culture. Louise Farrenc is a very notable female French composer in the 19th century. She was born in Paris in 1804, and on top of becoming a composer, she was also a virtuoso pianist and a teacher. In 1842, she became a professor of piano at the Paris Conservatory, which was a very prestigious position in Europe at the time, and she remained there for 30 years. Although I will be showcasing a piano work of hers, she was mainly known for her chamber music. This quote goes into deeper context of what women composers faced during these times. Another factor here is the public, as a rule, not a very knowledgeable one, whose only standard for measuring the quality of work is the name of its author. If the composer is unknown, the audience remains unreceptive, and the publishers, especially in France, close their ears away when someone offers them a halfway decent work. They believe in success only for trinkets. Such were the obstacles that Madame Ferenc met along the way, and which caused her to despair. The piece I am going to showcase in a couple minutes is signed Al Ferenc. I often wonder if she signed her works like this to not give away that she was a female, as L could stand for any male name such as Louis. If she signed her full name, the work would not get any attention or recognition that it deserved. It wasn't until 1830 that she gained fame as a performer, and then in 1842 she became a professor at the conservatory. Despite this prestigious position, she was still paid less than the male professors, and tried for nearly a decade to change this with no avail. But after she had a successful premiere of a composition of hers, she demanded equal pay once again and got it. This was a huge step for female composers and women in general during this century. Unfortunately, after her death, her works were largely forgotten until an interest in women composers led to her rediscovery in the 20th century. Since then, there have been many performances and recordings of her works. Talking specifically about her piano works now, as mentioned, in the beginning of her career she was composing exclusively for the piano, but later became famous for her chamber works. Some of her pieces drew high praise from critics, such as Robert Schumann. Impromptu for Piano was written in 1843, just as she was starting to write for chamber. In this piece, I hear influences of chamber-like passages. For example, at the start of the piece, I hear a violin duet, and in the B section, I hear a cello. Here is Impromptu for Piano by Louise Ferenc. Moving on from the early 1800s, we see a new trend in the arts called avant-garde. This trend was also in art, with Pablo Picasso being one of the avant-garde artists. Avant-garde was basically a means of critiquing existing aesthetic conventions, or a rejection of the normal in favor for the unique or original. It deliberately challenged or alienated audiences. Avant-garde is French for vanguard. The term is commonly used in French, English, and German to refer to people or works that were experimental or innovative, particularly with respect to art and culture. The picture I have on the slide here is one example of an avant-garde painting by Picasso. It challenges the audience as to what exactly the painting is. It mostly leaves it up to the imagination of each individual person. Avant-garde in music is considered to be at the forefront of innovation in its field. It represents a pushing of the boundaries of what is accepted as the norm. In music, this can be taken as extreme outlooks with a certain normal tradition that is already existent. Erik Satie was considered a Parisian avant-garde composer. He was born in Normandy and moved to Paris when he was just 4. His avant-garde music was a precursor to later artistic movements such as minimalism. In 1879, Satie entered the Paris Conservatoire, where he was soon labeled untalented by his teachers, which one of them labeling him as insignificant, laborious, and worthless, and the laziest student in the whole conservatory. After being sent home for 2.5 years, he was readmitted to the conservatory, but was unable to make a more favorable impression on his teachers than he had before, so he took up a military service a year later. However, his military career did not last long either. Within a few months, he was discharged after being accused of deliberately infecting himself with bronchitis. He then turned to composing, with Debussy helping draw public attention to Satie. After years of heavy drinking, Satie died at age 59 in 1925 from cirrhosis of the liver. Première Gymnopédie is a piece by Erik Satie written in 1888. The Gymnopédies, or Trois Gymnopédies, are 3 piano compositions, with Première Gymnopédie being the first of the 3. The work's unusual title comes from the French form of gymnopédia, the ancient Greek word for an annual festival where young men danced naked, or perhaps simply unarmed. Pierre Puvis de Chavannes' symbolist paintings may have been an inspiration for the atmosphere Satie wanted to invoke with these pieces. The 2 paintings on this slide are his, and give off the same atmosphere that I picture when I perform this piece. The melodies of the piece are deliberate but mild dissonances against the harmony, producing a melancholy effect that matches the performance instructions, which are to play each piece painfully, sadly, or gravely. From the second half of the 20th century on, the gymnopédies were often erroneously described as part of Satie's body of furniture music, perhaps because of John Cage's interpretation of them. Collectively, the gymnopédies are regarded as an important precursor to modern ambient music and a great example of avant-garde music. Here is Première Gymnopédie by Erik Satie. Symbolism was a movement that dominated the last half of the 19th century in both literature and music. Symbolism is a representation of an idea or a theme using symbols. They can be objects, colors, or general expressions. The music itself is symbolic of emotions, such as good and bad feelings, dreams, and messages. These are used to convey a specific meaning to the listener or reader. Many symbolists share the notion that all art should aspire to the condition of music, which was thought to be the most emotionally direct aesthetic medium. In Art Poétique in 1884, poet Paul Verlaine famously instructed poets on the importance of music before all else. So instead of literature affecting music, this time we have music affecting literature. This musicality in literature and poetry was achieved through rhyming, alliteration, and other rhetorical flourishes. No composer is more closely aligned with symbolism than Claude Debussy. He is famous for setting many symbolist writings to music, including several poems by Baudelaire and Mallarmé. Most famously, he wrote Prelude to the Afternoon of the Faun, meant to complement and extend Mallarmé's poem. Perhaps more important, Debussy approached musical composition with aims parallel to those of many symbolist poets. Debussy wrote that music should not be confined to producing nature more or less exactly, but rather to producing the mysterious correspondences which link nature with imagination. Not only was Debussy a symbolist composer, but he was also famously known as an impressionist composer. The difference here is that he rejected this term profusely. Impressionism in music was a movement where music focuses on mood and atmosphere, specifically conveying the moods and emotions aroused by the subject rather than a detailed tone picture. Impressionism is a philosophical and aesthetic term borrowed from late 19th century France painting Impressionism Sunrise by Monet, which happens to be the background of this slide. As you can see, Impressionist painters use starkly contrasting colors, effect of light on an object, a blurry foreground and background, a flattening perspective, etc., to make the observer focus his attention on the overall impression the painting gives him. In music, the most prominent feature of Impressionism is the use of color, or, in musical terms, timbre, which can be achieved through orchestration, harmonic usage, and texture. Impressionism also involves new chord combinations, ambiguous tonality, extended harmonies, use of modes and exotic scales, parallel motion, extra musicality, and evocative titles, such as in the piece I am about to play entitled Footprints in the Snow. Now on to Debussy. These two musical movements bring us to Claude Debussy, who was born in 1862. Debussy originally studied the piano, but found his vocation in innovative composition instead. He took many years to develop his mature style, and he was nearly 40 when he achieved international fame in 1902 with the only opera he ever completed, Pelléas et Mélisande. As mentioned before, he was greatly influenced by symbolist poetry and is actually known as one of the first impressionist composers, although he rejected the term. Debussy died from cancer at his home in Paris at the age of 55 after composing a career of only a little more than 30 years. Des Pas sur la Neige, or in English, Footprints in the Snow, is the sixth piece in Debussy's first book of preludes. It has been suggested that the D, E, and E, F pattern, prominent in the beginning of the piece and throughout the prelude, symbolizes the footprints in the snow by both the right and left foot in alternating fashion, typical symbolist ideas. Debussy also believed this should be played entre quatre yeux, which means between four eyes, meaning intimately. He wrote this piece for a private concert setting. The piece is one of four Debussy preludes in both books whose title origins are unknown. David Schiff suggests that the inspiration for the title could have stemmed from a painting depicting a snowy landscape, such as the one by Sicily on the right side of my slide. Although the prelude stays in its home key and does not modulate, it does go on to explore all 12 semitones in the octave throughout the whole piece. I hope you can depict the snowy landscape and other symbolistic and impressionistic aspects in this piece. reached the end of my timeline of my presentation, the first half of the 20th century. Francis Poulenc was a French composer and a pianist who was expected to follow his father into the family firm and was not allowed to enroll at music college. Later on in life, Poulenc met Eric Satie, whom I introduced earlier as being an avant-garde composer. Along with Satie, Poulenc became part of a group of young composers known collectively as Les Six. In his early works, Poulenc became known for his high spirits and irreverence, but during the 1930s, a much more serious side to his nature emerged, particularly in the religious music he composed from 1936 onwards, with which he alternated with his more lighthearted works. Poulenc made his debut as a composer in 1917, dedicating the piece to Satie, and in 1963, Poulenc suffered a fatal heart attack. Villageoise, translated to the villagers, was inspired by the French countryside. Although Poulenc considered himself Parisian by birth and by preference, rural France provided a creative inspiration for several of his piano works. Poulenc's music was often full of humor and sometimes romantic in a Parisian sort of way. His music in general is essentially diatonic, much unlike the Debussy piece we just heard. This is because the main feature of Poulenc's musical art is his melodic gift. His melodies are simple, pleasing, easily remembered, and most often emotionally expressive. The composer Lennox Berkeley wrote of him that all through his life, Poulenc was content to use conventional harmony, but his use of it was so individual, so immediately recognizable as his own, that it gave his music freshness and validity. You truly can hear the humorous side to Poulenc in this short piece I'm about to play. As he said himself, in all his works, he wanted music that was healthy, clear, and robust. Music as frankly French as Stravinsky is Slav. Here is Villageoise number 2, Staccato. I hope you enjoyed our capstone about the history of French and Italian keyboard literature and how each have been affected by the other.